Welcome, and thanks for listening to Cherry Bekaert's Government and Public Sector podcast series. In each episode, we hear from the best in the business on the latest challenges, trends, and opportunities affecting the government and public sector. I'm Christian Fjellgraf, leader of Cherry Bekaert's Government and Public Sector industry team. I hope you enjoy, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today. Today is the first part of our four-part series on GASB 101 Compensated Absences implementation. I'm your host, Danny Martinez, advisory partner at Cherry Bekaert. I lead our national team that provides government accounting assistance in a variety of ways to help out those accounting and financial reporting teams from having to deal with always the thing that's urgent to being able to focus on maybe the more strategic big picture items for their constituents. We're going to have four guests on this series as we walk through the four phases of implementation for GASB 101. And we're starting with the legend himself, Mr. GASB, as we like to call him, Scott Anderson. Welcome again, Scott. Would you please introduce yourself to our new listeners?
Thanks, Danny. Glad to be here. I kind of feel like Mr. GASB title has been taken by somebody else, but I'll answer to it. I've been with the firm for 20 years in Raleigh, in our North Carolina practice. I was in Florida. I spent a couple of years at the GASB as a practice fellow during the pandemic, and then I returned to Raleigh a couple of years ago, and I oversee our technical efforts on the audit government practice, and also help Danny with our advisory group.
Perfect. Maybe Captain GASB. I don't know if it's Captain GASB taken.
I'll take Captain GASB. That sounds better anyway.
All right. So we're walking through here with Captain GASB. So I'm going to take a minute here to set the stage, just to give you an idea of where we're headed with this four-part series. So GASB 101 Compensated Absences is effective for fiscal years ending December 31, 2024. So as we sit here in early 2025, the calendar year-end governments, the June 30s, 831s, 930s, they should all be thinking about implementation of GASB 101 if they haven't yet. So this guidance refreshes GASB's compensated absence guidance from the 90s because there's been changes to the types of compensated absences that have been offered by governments since that guidance was introduced. This standard has been rated to have a level of moderate level of effort for the implementation impact by GASB. And so why is that important? For all new accounting pronouncements where they have either a moderate or a high level of effort identified by the GASB, we here at Cherry Bekaert provide what we call a four-phase implementation approach that leads you from having no clue what this pronouncement is about to being fully implemented and having to plan not only to address the accounting for the implementation year, but as well going forward. So in each part of this series, we'll unpack one of those four phases that I touched on related to our implementation methodology. In this installment, we're going to cover the first phase. So our first phase is called Understanding the Standard. So within this Understanding the Standard umbrella, there's a couple aspects that we touch on. To give you a little bit of a sneak peek as to where we're headed, in phase 2, we'll talk about completeness and compensated absence identification. Phase 3 will touch on policy and procedure updates, as well as how to document what you're doing in an implementation memo for a smooth audit. And lastly, we'll touch on phase 4, which is journal entries, disclosure, and that go forward training. All right, perfect. So before we get into the specifics of phase 1, we want to set the table for our audience that is maybe just jumping into GASB 101 for the first time here in this new year. And so, Scott, can you help us with what a compensated absence is, how it's defined in GASB 101, and high level, how is the accounting and financial reporting changing from current guidance?
Sure. First, as you mentioned, GASB 16 was issued early 90s, 92, I believe, was when it was issued. And the intent of this new guidance was not to overhaul the old guidance. Rather, the intent was to reset it, to apply a conceptual framework that's now in place. Back when 92 was issued, there was only a concept statement 1. So none of the other concept statements were in place. Really, concept statement 4 was the one that I think impacts liability recognition the most, and that came out in 2007. So in light of those concept statements, it was necessary to take a look and see whether or not the guidance on compensated absences met or had a conceptual basis. The definition in the old standard is a compensated absence. Compensated absences are absences for which employees will be paid, such as vacation, sick leave, and sabbatical leave. Now, that is a very simple definition and one that nobody will argue with. It makes sense. However, it is a little bit limiting. The new definition is that a compensated absence is leave for which employees may receive one or more cash payments when the leave is used for time off. Other cash payments, such as payment for unused leave upon termination of employment, or non-cash settlements, such as conversion to a defined benefit post-employment benefits. So the two things that jump out, or the two main differences that I would point you to, is the new definition acknowledges that a compensated absence does not always result in an absence. An employee does not have to take an absence in order to reap the benefits of a compensated absence. So, and then the second part of that is that it's not necessarily paid out in cash. So you don't have to be absent, and it can be paid out through other means. And that definition is intentionally made broader to cover any possible scenario with a compensated absence. There are some items or arrangements that could meet that definition of a compensated absence that I just read, but that will not result in a liability. And so the guidance also provides some recognition criteria that should be applied in determining whether or not a compensated absence actually results in a liability for a government. And those three, just briefly, those recognition criteria is a leave that is attributed to services already rendered, leave that accumulates, and leave that is more likely than not to be used for time off or otherwise paid in cash or settled through non-cash items. So it's a more of a principle-based approach rather than the rules prescribed in GASB Statement 16.
Perfect. And if you're looking into your GASB 101, you have the pronouncement in front of you. You'll want to go to paragraph 9, and that's where it'll have those 3 items that Scott just touched on there for recognition. Also, if you're playing along with GASB terminology bingo, Scott did use the term concept statement in that first answer, which he loves to do. So go ahead and put your mark off on concept statement. Perfect, Scott. So from a practical level, we get approached at conferences all the time, and they say, well, what do I really need to be concerned about with this pronouncement? How will I know if I'm going to be seeing a big change in my liability balance? Or how do I know that it isn't just business as usual? Because there are some governments that early implemented, and some are saying, oh, it was a piece of cake, or some are saying, oh, it was really difficult. So how would a government that is just digging into this know or have an idea around if they could have a big change in that liability balance?
Yeah, so I'll give this answer from an auditor perspective. It makes me nervous as an auditor when I hear a government say that they've already implemented it and it was a piece of cake and it didn't change anything. I think that everyone should be concerned about the standard, even if it doesn't result in a change in your liability, because you want to be able to support why it did not change your liability. But for those who I think will have the biggest change in their liability are those who in the past have never recognized sick leave. Vesting was a criteria in GASB 16. So if sick leave did not get paid out upon termination, governments would not recognize the liability. That changes a bit here. Now vesting is not a criterion for recognition. Rather, you would apply a likelihood threshold that it would be used during the employment of the employee. So that's one thing that sticks out. The other thing that changes is the threshold. Probable was used in GASB Statement 16, whereas more likely than not is used in Statement 101. Some practitioners believe probable is a pretty high threshold, upwards to 80-90%, and it's not very well defined. More likely than not is a little bit more of a firm threshold. That's probably on your GASB bingo as well, right? More likely than not, or probable. And then the other thing that I would mention, I've seen in some governments in the past, when accruing compensated absences, that they would include retirement contributions as part of that. And there's always been a Q&A, an implementation guide question and answer that says you would not include contributions to defined benefit post-employment plans. I think that has been lost, and it's not really ever been super material, but this guidance is very explicit that you would not include that in your liability.
Perfect, thank you. So as we think about this first phase, understanding the standard that where we provide assistance, there's really two areas, or two things that we do within this phase of implementation. And the first is that customized training with GASB 101 that we would bring to a client's implementation team. So would you mind speaking to the importance of having the client's team having that training before they go into implementation? I think you touched on it a little bit earlier about how things, how it made you nervous when people said it was a piece of cake, but why do you think this customized training is so important?
Well, so why should they understand the standard in the first place? Here's my auditor response, which is an effective system of internal control contemplates ongoing compliance with GAAP. And if you don't understand the current GAAP, it's hard to say that you have effective internal control. So that's an important part. Even if it's not going to impact you, understanding the provisions in GAAP are important.
Perfect. I think that, so I'm sorry, that no matter how often that you talk about the idea of vesting, not automatically meaning recognition, but being a factor to contemplate in terms of the more likely than not, you can't kind of drill that point in enough. And I think like training like this, where you can show it and show why we're saying that and how we see that in the guidance, I think is super important too. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you asked why specialized training is important. And, you and I, we do webinars, we do podcasts. You have spoken at the GFOA. You're on kind of a speaking circuit. I don't know how many conferences you've spoken on GASB 101. There's plenty of content that's out there. One of the things that we do at Cherry Bekaert that I think helps with these implementations is doing customized one-on-one training, more of a workshop type situation where we are able to talk through your specific situations. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback when we've done those types of trainings for new GASB implementations.
Yeah, and to add into that, with the workshop basis, I love presenting. At these large conferences, you have hundreds of attendees, and then you have that like 10 to 15 minutes afterwards where the people can come up to you before the next session. Sometimes you're like checking, okay, my flight's in 2 hours. How many of these questions can we answer? And people have great questions, and so to be able to slow down, take the time, work with the implementation team, and answer them thoroughly and thoughtfully while I'm pulling up their ACFR or I'm pulling up their personnel policy, I think that really does provide some value there. So Scott, this understanding is even more important when you get to a system level or state level where you have multiple payroll and or HR departments that kind of roll up into the same financial statement. And sometimes that also happens with component units. So can you share what Cherry Bekaert does, in this understanding of the standard phase that helps with communication and understanding in those instances?
Yeah, we can take on that role. We can be the go-between. We can help in the communication to decentralized finance departments that have to roll up. We can help with the messaging. We can help consolidate the accounting policies that will be described in the note disclosures. So there's a lot of that. It's important when you've got decentralized departments that kind of have their own HR policies and their own financial statements to kind of have a consistent application or consistent interpretation of the new pronouncement.
Yeah, just to avoid any issues on the back end where people are thinking about things differently, maybe missing some things. Getting everyone on the same page, it can always be helpful. Well, perfect. We'll go ahead and stop it there, in keeping in line with trying to be around the 10-15 minute mark for these podcasts. So that's phase one. Thank you again, Captain GASB, for taking time today to discuss a couple ways we can help with phase one, understanding the standard. To our listeners, we hope that you continue along this journey with us over the next 2 months as we work through the 4 phases of implementation. If you just can't wait, you just had too much excitement, you want to dig into phases 2, 3, and 4 before these podcasts are out, we're signing people up now for our 4-phase GASB implementation solution. If you want to hear about all of the 4 phases, you want to sign up for that custom training, want to know how we can help, please shoot me an email at danny.martinez@cbh.com. You can shoot me a message on LinkedIn. You can also find Scott Anderson at sanderson@cbh.com as well on LinkedIn. Thank you again so much for your time, and we will see you next time.
This is Christian again. I hope you enjoyed this episode and look forward to our next one. Don't forget to subscribe.